Once again, the internal politics of a heavily gerrymandered purple state, Wisconsin, may have nationwide implications ahead of the 2024 presidential election. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. All right, folks, so more often than not, we cover nationwide politics here, but state politics and local politics are incredibly important as well, even if they don't generate, the recognition and the profile and the attention of the rest of the country. Well, we're going to revisit effectively Wisconsin because there was a race back in April of this year that did command national attention, which is relatively rare for a state election. It wasn't even a state gubernatorial race. It had nothing to do with the governor. It was a state Supreme Court race. Wisconsin has 7 seats on its Supreme Court, and at the time, there were 3 conservatives and 3 liberals, and the 4th conservative was retiring, and it was her seat that was up for election. And it was so important that I flew out to Wisconsin to join the efforts of 2 other groups. One was called Progress Libs, another was called Progressive Victory. There were members of Destiny's community, DGG, there. And we all went around knocking on doors in late March in the freezing, bitter Wisconsin cold to try to increase voter turnout. The situation is this. Judge Janet Protasiewicz, the liberal candidate, she won. She won the election, thank God, and it signaled a potentially a new dawn, so to speak, for the state of Wisconsin, and again, by implication, perhaps the rest of the country. Because, of course, Wisconsin is a swing state. And when I say a swing state, I do mean a swing state. They went for Obama, I think, in 2008, 2012, but went for Trump in 2016, went for Biden in 2020. It was a heavily contested site between Biden and Trump. As a matter of fact, Trump attempted to use Wisconsin to try to overturn the results of the 2020 election by contesting the electoral ballots cast there, and it made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court said, no, we don't want any part of this. So anyway, it's really, really important. And when I say that not only is it a swing state, it's a purple state. It's not a red state. It's not a blue state. It's a purple state. Now, Wisconsin doesn't do partisan elections, right? So there's not really a lot of voter registration information available. But according to Pew and other credible pollsters, the state is basically split. It's 42% conservative, 42% liberal, and then the remainder are independent, right? So it's like a coin flip, okay? And yet, for basically 12 years, 13 years, the Republican Party in Wisconsin have effectively had a gerrymander. They've effectively had, a supermajority through gerrymandering, because there was a rare opportunity in which they had the courts, the governorship, and the state assembly on their side, and enough of a majority to heavily skew the maps. And when I say heavily, I mean insane margins. It is gerrymandered to hell and back, even though, again, it's a purple state. So that's why the election of Judge Janet Protasiewicz, now Justice Protasiewicz, this was so important, because there are going to be lawsuits filed. They are already filed, and they will be seen before this court, which has the potential to strike down those heavily gerrymandered voting maps and make it much more equitable, where Democrats can actually be competitive in Wisconsin. The problem is the Republican supermajority, they don't want it. Now, again, just for a bit of clarification, so right now the Supreme Court has 4 out of the 7 seats are liberal, right? They're not Democrat, even though they're effectively Democrat, but they're liberal. The governor, Evers, he is Democrat. But in both chambers of the Wisconsin State Assembly, they have a Republican super majority, okay? The situation is this. Now that, pull it up here, now that Janet Protasiewicz is on the bench, there's increasing likelihood, it's inevitable, that a case is about to show up before the Supreme Court challenging the constitutionality of those voting maps. And Republicans in the state assembly are demanding that Justice Janet Protasiewicz step down, okay, because they say she's biased, because she did indicate during the election season that she thought the maps were gerrymandered, which they are by all consensus, and we'll get into that in a minute. So Democrat won the Wisconsin State Supreme Court race in a landslide this spring. Now the state legislative GOP threatens her with impeachment if she rules against the gerrymandered maps that have created their majorities, okay? So this is, I think his name is Robin Vos. He is the Speaker of the State Assembly. He's signaled that he will impeach Justice Protasiewicz if she refuses to step down, okay? Now, if I remember correctly, if let's say she does step down and let's say the remaining 6 justices adjudicate the case, if it's split, and it almost certainly will be, I believe that just automatically reaffirms, like it doesn't overturn the law. It just basically keeps things the way they are. So, and the status quo heavily advantages the Republican Party. This is arguably the most gerrymandered state in the country. And not only is it the internal politics, but you have United States Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, who, by the way, he's a MAGA cultist. He's deranged. He's stupid. He's just all the worst adjectives. Now, even he is saying that Justice Protasiewicz should step down from certain cases, including the gerrymandered maps. He says, hopefully she'll do the right thing, the Republican senator said following a roundtable, blah, 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 about reducing barriers for incarcerated people who are reentering society. She's obviously biased in this area. She should not be judging on it, okay? Now, I just want to point out, even though it's not the Wisconsin Supreme Court, I can't imagine that Ron Johnson, the Republican senator of Wisconsin, felt similarly when, say, conservative Justice Clarence Thomas remained and adjudicated a case about sending, about complying with a congressional subpoena for information about the January 6th insurrection, when Justice Clarence Thomas's wife was like, it was her text messages. She was materially involved in the case, and he refused to recuse himself. And that's once again an example of the asymmetry of expectation. Republicans want they want Democrats and liberals and whoever disagrees with them to recuse themselves, even when there's a semblance, a ghost of a possibility in their mind of bias, let alone conflict of interest. But they don't hold themselves to that standard. So right off the bat, as far as I'm concerned, we shouldn't either. It's like, okay, even if I grant you that Judge Janet Protasiewicz is biased in this case and that she does believe that the maps are gerrymandered, why should, especially when the stakes are so high, why should we always adhere to a ridiculous one-sided standard that you all never adhere to, ever under any circumstances? But let's set that aside. Let's go back to the impeachment situation. So Republicans have asked Justice Janet Protasiewicz to step down from the redistricting cases because she repeatedly called the maps rigged during her campaign, which they are. She was basically saying that a circle is round and that, an apple's a fruit. The Wisconsin electoral maps are rigged. It's a statement of observable reality. The GOP Assembly Speaker has threatened to impeach if she does not recuse herself, and we're going to get into what that might mean in just a second. But here's the kicker. Not only is it observable to the rest of the external world that Wisconsin's maps are gerrymandered, the Republican Speaker of the Wisconsin State Assembly, Voss, the one who is threatening to impeach Janet Protasiewicz, also admitted that the maps are biased towards Republicans. At one point, in response to questioning, this was from back in 2021, from a colleague, Voss came out and admitted that the partisan advantage had indeed been a consideration in drawing the maps. So to be clear, Representative Voss, partisan advantage is not an intent of these maps? So it's not an intent? And he says, no, it is. It's clearly a constitutional allowance. The Supreme Court, as you know, said there is no problem. There is no constitutional prohibition on that criteria. So yes, was partisanship considered as a consideration of the map? Yes, there are certain times that partisanship was. So clearly the maps were drawn in a way to give them a partisan advantage. And that iteration of the Supreme Court defended it. They're like, yeah, well, we're going to defend these heavily gerrymandered maps in this split purple state. For every one conservative voter, you can find a liberal conservative voter, but we don't care. Republicans can draw the map however they damn well please and make it heavily gerrymandered. Impossible, virtually impossible under the current maps for Democrats to ever have a majority, okay? Or to even, realistically stand a chance of defeating a Republican supermajority. It's just so easy in Wisconsin for Republicans to have a legislative victory given these maps. And actually, there is some question about whether or not, again, those are constitutional. Because, again, right now, there are additional constitutional challenges to those maps that Judge Janet Protasiewicz and her 3 liberal justices will overhear. And I know I've been talking about this for 10 minutes. I'm trying to be mindful of time, but this is so important. Now, I want to address 2 final things. One is directly relevant to this, and then another is a different situation with the Wisconsin Supreme Court. But then the question becomes, okay, what happens if she doesn't recuse herself and they impeach her? Well, the good news, there's good and bad news. Okay, number one, assuming that they can do it, right? which legally there's some question over whether or not Republicans can simply impeach a Supreme Court justice for not recusing herself without some serious, like, you need to go beyond, she called a map rigged, okay? But on the other hand, impeachment's a political tool, so it's entirely possible that they'll try to make the case anyway and say, I know this sounds ridiculous, but we're going to do it anyway because we have the votes. So let's just grant the premise that she doesn't recuse herself, they decide to impeach her, and they're successful. The good news is we have a Democratic governor, or they have a Democratic governor in Wisconsin, and he gets to fill any vacancies. So if you take Janet Protasiewicz out, technically Democratic Governor Evers could shop around for another person, like, hey, do you think these maps are rigged? Sure do. Boom. Okay. And I suppose as long as he or she doesn't publicly campaign on it, it wouldn't be a problem. Or perhaps he would never be so brazen to ask the question. Perhaps he would just be familiar enough with a particular judge's political beliefs or their leanings based on their rulings and just get them to take Janet Protasiewicz's place. And the legislature can't do anything about that. But what they can do is they can impeach Janet Protasiewicz, but not convict her. And she would temporarily be in this limbo where she's impeached, but she's not been convicted in an impeachment trial. And so even though she hasn't been removed from office, according to Wisconsin law, she's in a limbo where she basically can't decide cases, right? So that would be like their chip. Like, okay, we'll impeach her, so she can't sit on the bench and preside over cases, but we can't convict her, so she gets kicked out of office, and Governor Evers can replace her with somebody else. Although, now that I'm thinking about it out loud, I guess she could resign, which would create a vacancy during her term, which Governor Evers could fill. I hope that doesn't come to it because she seems like a really competent jurist. So anyway, that's the situation. It's like constant, like it's this weird hyper-partisan chess game on part of the Republicans. They just don't want, Wisconsin to have to be, a fair political terrain, even though it's a purple state. But the last thing I want to say on Wisconsin Supreme Court is one of the conservative justices who remains on the bench is so mad that new liberal majority is throwing its weight around. And I love it. It makes me so happy that they're throwing their weight around because conservatives do it all the time. It's okay for liberals to do it too because, number one, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. But number two, liberals do it for better reasons. The left does it for better reasons. So in response, during a court filing, one of the conservative justices on the Supreme Court basically threw a tantrum. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but, these 4 justices will adopt new maps to shift power away from Republicans and bestow an electoral advantage for Democrat candidates, fulfilling one of Protasiewicz's many promises to the principal funder of her campaign. Number one, I'm not entirely sure that it bestows an electoral advantage for Democrats simply to reduce the electoral advantage that Republicans have cynically gotten for themselves. Like, if you and I are in conflict and you make it so that I'm less advantaged, are we really going to spin that as you taking the advantage? I don't know. Although, honestly, again, if turnabout's fair play, I don't see why Democrats at least shouldn't threaten, like, hey, if you're really so concerned with gerrymandering, what would you do? How would you feel if we did it to you? How would you feel if not only we reduce what you've done to the state, but we do it in the opposite direction and give Wisconsin 13 years worth of a Democratic supermajority? How would you feel about that? And of course, they would hate that. At least the Republicans would. So anyway, it would just be interesting to ask the question. But the justice who complained about this on the Wisconsin Supreme Court is deranged. As I mentioned in a tweet responding to it, this woman in a previous Supreme Court case in front of her name is Rebecca Grassley. I think it's Rebecca Grassel Bradley. She also was the lone dissent in a Wisconsin Supreme Court case in which even the other conservatives ruled against her. And it was about the Second Amendment. And she took the position because the facts of the case were about a particular person getting drunk, brandishing a firearm, waving it around in front of their roommates, threatening their roommates, and then threatening to kill anybody who came in through the door. So the majority also misapprehends the difference between operating a firearm in self-defense and going armed in the case of confrontation. The fact that Kristen did not act in self-defense has nothing to do with his Second Amendment right to go armed in case of confrontation. And this is the part. While many readers may not be troubled by the outcome of this case in light of Kristen's threatening behavior towards his roommates and their guests, the majority's decision erodes a fundamental freedom, the true palladium of liberty for all Americans. So she once asserted, again, by herself, even the other conservatives were like, this goes way too far, that a person has a constitutional right to own a firearm. It's so absolute that they can get drunk, pull it out, threaten others with it, and threaten others who also live in the house, by the way, and also threaten to kill anybody who knocks on the door with it. That's crazy. So anyway, that's the state of affairs in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. It'll be interesting to see how Democrats play this out. It's incredibly important. It's incredibly important that on the broader scale, that Governor Evers and the liberal majority in the Wisconsin Supreme Court work to undo the incredibly cynical, disgusting, hyperpartisan, indefensible, hypocritical gerrymander that Republicans have fixed for themselves. It is not only this would be the case in any purple state, but it's also a purple swing state. So what happens in Wisconsin as a result from this, it doesn't just affect the people in Wisconsin. This could have national implications for the 2024 election, and that's why we got to see this through.